Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's brunch somewhere, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you here today. My name is Gus. I am a political economist and the co-founder at FutureCrunch.
And my name is Shasta. I am an entomologist and an invertebrate ecologist. I am a FutureCrunch facilitator.
We have got a really great conversation today. Before we get into it, though, we just want to acknowledge that we are broadcasting, both Shasta and I, on the traditional lands of the First Nations people of Australia. Where I am, these include the lands of the Bunurong, Bunwarang, and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And their name for the place that I'm in, Fitzroy, was Ngarago. So we respectfully acknowledge their elders, along with the indigenous elders of this entire continent and its islands. Shasta, where are you broadcasting from?
I'm in Tasmania, so I am in Lutruwita, the traditional lands of the Palawa people and continuing lands of the Palawa people. There is snow on Kunanyi, Mount Wellington, over Hobart this morning, which is always beautiful and a bit surreal as we attempt to make our way into spring here.
Wonderful. We're all part of this land. The land's part of us. So we invite you to join all of us, wherever you are, in learning about growing with and protecting the land and all of its beings alongside our indigenous communities, not just here in Australia, but across the entire planet. So today we have got a great guest, Professor Sarah Hendren, who's joining us from Boston. Sarah, good evening.
Good evening. So good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to exploring some of your work, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Let me just add too that I am on the unceded territory of the Massachusetts people here in the area of what's now known as Boston. But I thank you for that land acknowledgement, and I join you in trying to honor those elders.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Wherever you are, if you're joining us today, if you would like to tell us where you're joining us from, in the chat box over here. So please let us know where you are and where you're tuning in from. So, Sarah, we always start these conversations with the same question for our guests, which is, what has surprised you the most about 2020?
What has surprised me the most about 2020? That acute situations of despair and danger have failed to unite more than they might have. I mean, history shows as much unification in moments like these as there is disunity. And so while disunity is also in history, I must say I'm astonished at the lack of that joining together impulse that I've seen happen in my own adult lifetime, and that I've certainly seen in historical periods. And we have to be specific about that and not nostalgic about the past. But boy, I've been quite surprised at how tenuous the ties have been, honestly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that somebody managed to humorously hit the nail on the head when they pointed out on the internet commentary that the zombie movies always failed to illustrate the people standing out in the street demanding their right to get bitten by zombies.
Yeah, right.
But
right.
Has your work, kind of like, researching people, as in very broad terms, has that given you kind of any insight into, what has happened to us this year?
Well, certainly I have learned. So my book is a bringing together a kind of translation for a non-expert reader in the deep field of disability studies, which is part of my training. And that is mostly disabled scholars themselves, writing from their own experience, but also in their histories and also in scholarship and understanding what disability is as a lived experience. So I've been a student of that for a good decade, and then a lot of stories are bringing that stuff together. And I will say that the deepest, most profound kind of knowledge and experience that disability studies brings and offers to the world is this fundamental notion of human interdependence that is, a kind of real rebuke to individualism, to this kind of the the self as like a productive economic unit only. And so, boy, we needed that message and that insight and that wisdom before 2020. I think it's fair to say we need it especially now. So, in other words, disabled people have been saying for a long time that the needing of one another, that needfulness, political and personal, is actually a natural state of the human. Mm-hmm. And the more we make that actually visible and unifying and organize around it, then the more desirable worlds we get. Mm-hmm. So that wisdom has been on offer for a long time. I will just hype a friend's book, Alice Wong, who often says these days that disabled people are kind of modern day oracles when it comes to 2020. That is for everything from needing equipment to do social distancing and sort of plan for your body in ways that don't match the built world, but then also the incorporation of help and mutual aid into normative life, right? And that certainly in my own country, we are not able to organize around that for any number of historical, but also very present reasons. So,
yeah.
These, so I think the themes there are quite clear. I want to take this a step back, and this word, disability, quite loaded. What I love about your book, this really kind of blew my mind, is that you're really great on trying to kind of look at language in a different way. And there were two words in particular that really stood out for me. One was disability, and changing the meaning of what it means to be disabled, who is disabling who. And the second was the idea of a misfit, of not being fitted correctly. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about both of those words and the way that you see them, disability and misfit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're in a time when language is a subject that a lot of people negotiate and argue about, and we can talk about how that's of our moment in a particular way. But in disability, for actually a couple of decades, certainly in the US and I think in other parts of the world, that a contingent of the disability activist community would actually claim disabled as an adjective for their lives. And so the book opens actually with we meet a woman in my lab at an engineering school named Amanda, who is a little person, has a form of dwarfism, actually Australian by birth. And she would call herself disabled. And this was surprising, of course, to my engineering students who are non-disabled people. But she would call herself disabled in the way that many people that I know who are disabled would also use that word. They would not call themselves specially challenged or differently abled even. And the reason is a kind of politically strategic one. So in the last couple of decades, disabled people have realized, okay, there's a couple of reasons. One is a kind of insight in disability studies that you can think of disability as a medical condition. And of course, plenty of disabilities are actually, yes, scientific medical conditions. But the production of the way disability happens in people's lives isn't just about the properties of their body. So if somebody is using a wheelchair, right, their legs do not ambulate in the built environment, right? But a wheelchair is a perfectly useful way to get around. It's that the world is actually full of stairs that actually make it impossible for a wheelchair to navigate. So then it's like, okay, I have the fact of my legs, but I also have the fact of the world. And that's where the actual, disjuncture is happening. That's where the friction is. So disabled people have said, you can have a purely medical model of disability where you just think about what's happening in the body, or you could also take on a social model of disability. And this changes everything, because what that means is that disability actually lives between this body and this table and this chair and that street and that step and all the curbs and the sidewalks and all the built stuff of the world. So literally the location expands our vision. So disabled people have said, I'm disabled, not because of the way my legs work, not because of my stature or my height, but because of the way my body doesn't match the standardized built world, that the world is full of stairs that is disabling to me, and therefore I'm disabled. You can imagine, right, that this is politically strategic in order to make common cause with people who have all kinds of bodies that are at odds with the built world. So blind folks and deaf folks and folks in wheelchairs, their bodies are not the same. But to use the word disabled is to say, wow, the world is not built for everyone. That's a profound and kind of sharp political statement. For lobbying purposes, right? To say we actually want a world where the match is actually better. And then the second word that you mentioned is actually from Rosemary, Garland, Thompson, who is one of the kind of founding scholars in the field. So I talk readers through her idea of the misfit. And this is another way of putting it, which is to say, if I'm a misfit, I can think of that as something that's like my quirkiness, right? Or I can say, I'm a square peg in a round hole, meaning, right, in that same way, my body doesn't go upstairs, right? And so I'm a misfit, but the misfit is not just a property of mine. It's actually between me and the world and back, right? So it's a multi-directional kind of thing. So the question becomes, do I need a better body or do I need a better world? And that's a fundamentally different question altogether, right? So Rosemary Garland Thompson, who coined this term of the misfit, she has two very atypically shaped arms and hands. And so she doesn't grasp a fork or a book or her iPhone or anything in the way that a two-handed person like me does. So she thinks about this all the time, that she is all the time navigating, negotiating, adapting her body. But she is also, as a scholar and as a thinker and as an activist, asking for a world to flex and bend its structures toward her a little bit too. Yeah. And by the way, she has found that in things like even a smartphone, right? Just speech to text. It's quite extraordinary for a person who's trying to negotiate the world. So yeah, the book is trying to, again, just translate what's been happening in this rich field of disability studies for a long time. And I'm just sort of like shining a spotlight on it and telling you that disability is a concept that is really rich, fertile ground for each of us, no matter what body we're in, to just rethink, who is the world built for? And where is the friction in the life that I live and the ones of my loved ones, right? And I'm talking about people living with acute depression. I'm talking about people with slightly diminished balance, right? Just because they're getting older. I'm talking about, right, the conditions that people have not really thought of as quite generatively organized around this idea of disability, which really is a universal and fundamental part of life. So both misfitting and disability, they're not the same, right? But they are on offer as a form of knowledge and wisdom for us to go, I'm going to rethink, right? Where is the locus of the misfit and what's the world that we want?
Yeah, I was really energized by that concept that you've, for me, introduced as you're highlighting. You're bringing together other people's ideas, but that it's at least 50% onus of the square peg and 50% onus on the round hole. That it's not only just going in one direction. But I don't know if you've been specifically working on implanting this idea, but the first thing I thought of is that it really turns disability into a spectrum that everyone then fits on, even hitherto able-bodied people.
Yeah, that's right.
I thought it was really interesting. It gives you that opportunity, or it gave me maybe a window to look through to specifically look at my world and understand it perhaps in a similar kind of frame, like which things don't work. And yeah, I was interested how you seem to create that opportunity to kind of feel a greater sense of connection with the concept of the disabling world.
That's right. And I'm so glad that came across, Shasta, because I think a lot of times conversations like this are about a fairly paltry idea about inclusion. And I'm not against inclusion, right? I think thinking person could be against inclusion. But I think actually, again, having studied the work of so many others and done so much design work of my own, and I also share life with a son who has Down syndrome, who's 14, have a number of family members on the autism spectrum and who have lived with chronic depression for decades. So I am thinking about this in my own little ecosystem too. But when you're saying, right, my invitation to the reader is to find yourself connected there. Not to say we're all disabled, right? That would be kind of a lazy thinking answer. But not also to say, oh, I belong to the land of the able-bodied, and therefore my role is to be inclusive, right? To extend the social and political goods of the world, extend the canopy of those, and to welcome in folks who have not been before. But actually, in disability, the invitation is to actually go like, oh, I live in a body that has needs, that is extended with stuff all the time. I mean, what are these reading glasses, right? If not assistive technologies for my changing eyesight. That's right. And what is my so-called smartphone, the things that I outsource to it, the ways that it elegantly, fits into my life, the things that make me less of a whole human being. It's a rich, complicated ecosystem of assistance. And if everyone, no matter what, sees themselves as on the giving and the receiving end of assistance, like that's a different social organization, right? That means we belong to one another in a different kind of way. So more than inclusion, I'm hoping that people say, oh, I live on that same human plane, right? Of this body with its vulnerabilities, with its needs for assistance. And that could actually be a dignifying and even salutary part of my life without romanticizing it at all, but dignified and salutary nonetheless.
Yeah.
And it's very, very human that so many. Here was this stat that just blew my mind in the book, which was that the World Health Organization says that about 1 billion people, 15% of the global population, live with a disability. And they define disability as people whose operation of body or mind falls outside the canopy of what we deem as normal. So can we talk a little bit about this idea of what normal is, and maybe how we kind of recast that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a report, so folks know, from 2011. That's a fairly recent number, and I think everyone was kind of surprised at just the sheer scale of that. And the report is online.
It's amazing. It is totally human. It's the most human thing possible to
that's right.
Have the operation of body or mind falling outside the normal.
That's right. Because again, if we think about aging alone, right, then we know that it is a human concern to think about the different and needs of our bodies and our lives over the lifespan. Right. So, the idea of normalcy, certainly in industrialized cultures, right, that have been organized around technology pressed into the service of markets and market economies, that idea of normal belongs to the social sciences and really arises as a social science only about 200 years ago. People tend to think of this. So when you go now, take a young child to the pediatrician's office, you will invariably be told, let's measure their height and their weight, and let's then rank them right on a percentile scale of where they fall relative to other children at that age. And we do this not only in the pediatrician's office, but in high stakes testing all over the world. We rank and sort people based on percentiles. And again, the measure of worth is looking sideways here to here. Who compared to whom, where do I fall? And you can imagine, of course, that the social sciences of statistics are quite useful for us in lots of situations. We do want to understand populations as groups. And so we want to understand where the kind of, key features and behaviors and patterns are.
Picked up this way, it does sound dramatically dystopian at the same time.
when it's put that way. And what social scientists call this is the aggregative fallacy, meaning numbers in aggregate themselves, again, are not evil, right? And we understand the uses of studying groups as social sciences. But the aggregative fallacy is when we start thinking about ourselves in relation to other people as the sole measure of our worth. And also when social sciences are then pressed into the service of creating incentives for citizens only to function at those high levels and those competitive levels, and to find, again, their worth in comparison to one another and to be sort of high functioning in those economically productive ways. Like, in other words, normalcy comes to take on, over the 19th century, I talk about this in the book, and there's a whole realm of scholarship about this. Normalcy comes to take on not just the measuredness of comparison, but that being on the sort of better genetically or performing side of normal comes to take on the heft of better and best, that it starts to become, especially in the eugenic era, like very into the 19th century, early 20th century, in my own country and elsewhere, it starts to take on this, not just a kind of measurement, but a goal to try to be optimized and achieved. And so you get a whole discourse of, eugenic logic about trying to optimize and perfect human populations. And we know how ugly this got, right, in the early 20th century. And so the long history, again, of normal, perhaps the ugliestness of that eugenic logic is behind us. Nonetheless, there's a very long tail and a very naturalized sense in which we measure our worth and the worth of others in terms of those kind of performing, like optimal citizen, kind of work. And again, high stakes testing is the classic example here, right? We want to sort of rank people so that then they go to the best colleges, so they become what? The most valuable workers in the quick processing of information and tabulations sense. So you can imagine as a parent of a kid with Down syndrome, just how vivid this becomes in life, right? Where here is a person who's misfitting, whose round, hole, square peg conundrum is not actually about a missing limb, and it's not actually about a sensory difference in terms of like blindness or deafness. It's about being a misfit with the economic order. That's what it is. To have non-normative intelligence is to not rank in that normalcy range that is optimizable for productive citizenship. So you got, so listeners who are joining us tonight may think like, well, that's terrible, like every person counts and so on. Fine. But what is, if the ground of human worth is not that kind of normal measurement, then what is the ground of human worth? I mean, this again is a difficult question that I think disability forces us to ask. What is the dignity of being human if it isn't that kind of productive citizenship and the percentiles and the functioning and so on?
Yeah.
So that was an answer to this. But
you're making me think. I mean, I'm really interested as a biologist how our human evolution, from the thousands and thousands of years that we've been roaming savannas and poking things with sticks, kind of is impacting and it's the direct bedrock that our modern clad lives are trying to balance on. And I think you're kind of highlighting again how some of that tension comes out of our animal nature. Disability 200 years ago, as you said, post pre-industrial revolution, would have been a completely different thing. The assumptions about all of our lives were completely different, although I suppose disability in those times would have potentially been less prevalent because you had to be the single most successful human to be part of the human population as a survival of the fittest kind of thing, hopefully not in a value judgment way.
Yeah. Well, so, it's complicated, right? I mean, this is where history gets really deep and specific, and we'd have to go back to like, where are we talking about and for whom? But yeah, go ahead.
But not only with attitudes, which I think we were just talking about, attitude changing the landscape of disability, but also technology must be having a significant impact on the landscape of disability. And our team, we love technology. We love talking about technology. We can only presume that the people who are still here with us must love hearing about technology. So is there a few like real gold nugget pieces of tech that exist now or that you see coming that are like just really making an awesome, exciting impact in the accessibility sphere?
Yeah, well, so Shasta, but I wanted to just pick up on this thing when you were talking about ever since we were wielding sticks, like in our, like, were you trying to poke, but just like the universalness of tool use? Because I think that's also really interesting, right? Like, in other words, if I say, well, this is the modern equivalent of assistive technology, right? That, I mean, basically it's just a redundancy that tools are giving us help. And there's a reason why, one of the reasons we mark civilizations is at the moments that we see tool use. It's not the only one. Being social and socially organized is a really important factor in that. But we do mark those tool use as a fundamental way of how we organized and planned and executed the things we needed to get done to nourish ourselves, right, and to defend ourselves and all that. So tool use and assistance is fundamental to being human. I mean, I think what people will find, in a decade of study, what I've been interested in is not, I'm interested in technology, but not in the kind of breathless celebration of like sort of post-human cyborg technology that has, in my sort of scanning of the popular media, that's what I see everywhere, which is to say one story, which is if you lose a body part, then the best that money can buy will swoop in and strap on the replacement arm for you and will catapult you then into the future. And you need not think of your body as either vulnerable or fragile in any way. And indeed, right, the kind of promise there. But remember, in that story, built with all of its assumptions, as it is, also like the technology is actually the protagonist there, right? The technology comes into people's
Yeah.
lives and then, right, makes a
And,
difference.
and disability is still the enemy there.
That's right.
Like,
right.
you're not disabled. You've got a super arm. You're better than before. It's like there's
That's right.
the assumption that it was, negative.
That's
Because
right.
your economic value is now depleted.
That's right. And again, just from studying so much in disability studies, like then you enforce a kind of idea that you have to overcome the body, right? That you're not defined by your disability. All of that just keeps putting the impairment and the stigma back on that person and making it their job to kind of, again, overcome. Why? For that kind of normalcy mindset, to reassure everyone else. So what I want to say, I'm not just interested in critiquing that though. What the book is full of counterexamples where I think the story gets really, really interesting. And it's everything from, the book is organized in multiple scales. And I do look at prosthetic limbs, and I hang out for an afternoon with a man who has an $80,000 arm, and I look at what he can do and what he can't do, right? It's really quite something. But we also drop in that same chapter on a man named Chris, who was born with one arm. He has a residual limb on one side, and for whom half a dozen prosthetic limbs were built for him when he was a child. And the doctors told his parents, oh, certainly Chris will need a prosthesis. I mean, how could he not? But Chris, like a lot of, all humans are deeply, deeply adaptive. And any of us who was born in the way Chris would be equally deeply plastic and adaptive with the one arm. It's the only thing he ever knew. So at the same time that the doctors were saying, let us build you this arm, he was taking a couple of, Legos, and he would scoop up two and brace one against his shoulder, right, and snap the other one on top. And he was a little toddler, right? So they were like, here's this big arm, and it was just like a total albatross. Like, it wasn't a useful kind of thing. So to me, that's really interesting. Not that Mike, who has this incredible, arm that, again, is the best that engineering can do, it's not that his is sort of high tech and, the adaptation that Chris does is low tech. And I should say, we drop in on Chris at a moment where he actually is doing what tends to be a two-handed task, and that is changing the diaper of his newborn baby. And when he did hit that moment in his 30s, he thought, well, I do need to have an adaptive tool. So we have I have a picture of him in there with this little $10 harness, made out of felted, cords that he uses to actually suspend his little baby's ankle so that he can change his diaper one-handed. And to me, the contrast to that is just, it returns us to the fascination of the body, right? That the universality of adaptation. So that chapter is like, here's Mike with this incredible arm, which, by the way, is a legacy of World War II and kind of the rehabilitation engineering, huge amounts of research dollars poured into the kind of innovation labs around giving back those men, because it was all men at that time, the limbs that they had lost. And so we place that kind of in historical context. But we meet Chris, who has opted out of prosthetic limbs. And we go to India to look at the Jaipur foot, which is a low-tech prosthetic lower leg limb that's been produced and distributed for free at the scale of 1.5 million. So all of that limb chapter is this kind of like super faceted, turn it like a jewel, treatment of what do we mean by, an extended limb, and what are all the forms it could come in. And some people opt in and some people opt out. And all of that is to help the reader say, if and when my body changes, what are the choices that I'll make? And what are the resources that I'll marshal to help me make those choices? So we meet Audre Lorde, the great, prophetic essayist and poet on race and gender and so many topics. We meet her in the doctor's office after a mastectomy, and she was also opting out of the replacement breast prosthesis. And she learns, right, that the nurses are kind of invested in her actually wearing that. They don't actually want her to be that asymmetrical body. She's just glad to have survived the cancer. And then she's getting these messages like, wear the prosthesis so that the rest of us can feel good about who you are, right? So prosthetics are never, this is what it means to be biopolitical. And the mask, of course, is our most biopolitical object right now. But all prosthetics, all assistive technologies are telling us a lot about what we think of as the normative body, about gender, about achievement, about all those things. So
this is one of the things that I really love about your book, Sarah. It's been a long time since I've read a book that made me look at the world so differently. And even today, on my way, into the office, I was looking at the sidewalks differently. I was looking at cars. I was looking at shops. I was looking at the steps. It's really great. One of the things that I loved, one of the objects that it's really made me look differently at is chairs. Let's talk about chairs. And let's talk about chairs and cardboard in particular.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Yeah, so let me just, by way of context, zoom out for 1 second. I've got this light that is a motion sensor thing, sorry. So the book is intentionally structured to expand and scale. So that limb chapter that I just detailed for you is like, okay, what's the closest stuff we wear in the body? The next chapter called Chair is about the products and furniture in our lives. The next scale out, of course, is the room that we live in. So architecture and interiors. The next scale out is streets and how we get down the road and being public. And finally, the last chapter is called Clock, which is a conceptual object about time, what happens when we misfit around time. And there I get in a little bit to developmental disability in my own son. So, right, the chair, so we've sort of left behind these objects that we wear on our bodies with limb. And chair is a look at what's called universal design. So probably people who are in tech on this call, if they think of disability and design, they either think of those really cool, $80,000 limbs or 3D printed prosthetics, or they might be thinking, oh, you mean universal design, right? And so universal design is what gave us closed captioning, for example. So deaf watchers of television were lobbying in the 1980s for closed captioning to be built into the TV set that a lot of people use now. So before that time, you had to buy a little box that would then attached to your TV. And again, at least the legal structure here in the United States changed in the very late 80s, so that now when you buy a TV set, right, it is just packed with closed captioning, full stop. And that was a hard won legal fight that lots of people thought was like for a specialty niche audience, like only deaf watchers of television would use this. But I bet you anything, there's a statistically significant number of people on the call who are hearing folks who watch the TV with their captions on. To say nothing of the fact that when you're in the airport or, in a restaurant, you're watching and following the debate or the game or whatever from across the room because you can see the words and not just even when you're out of earshot. So universal design is a logic in design that says, go actually to the margins of experience. So at those tail ends of the bell curve of normal, go out to those margins, and in those margins, you will actually find insight into human behavior and needs that actually benefit everyone. Okay, so that's like all ships rise kind of design logic. So, for instance, beyond closed captioning, do you folks have the Oxo Good Grips kitchen line? It's like black rubber handles.
Not really, but we know what you mean. It's kind of a big funky handles for various kitchen utensils. Yes.
Yeah, that was those ergonomic handles that have the black chunky rubber that are easy to squeeze and grip, and they also have little fins in them that tell you right where to place your thumb, designed from the condition of arthritis. So again, somebody was saying, why is this kitchen implement so hard to use? It doesn't have to be this way. And from that, you get this entire paradigm shift about what a kitchen tool should feel like and do. Okay, so universal design. That's also behind the Aeron chair, which is this very fancy kind of high status chair that people may know, where you can do any number of things with the tilt of the seat and the back and the height and the armrest and so on. So universal design, again, is thought of as this, like, that's the one and only story about where disability and design matters, meaning only if you can get a widget that scales to the level of 100,000 or 1 million will it count and be worth your time, right? And that's a 19th century model of manufacturing. So we could talk all about that. But right up next to the Aeron chair, which is again this widget, that's mass manufactured, I take the reader to a storefront in the Garment District of Manhattan, where chairs are being built every day out of cardboard, triple cardboard. So I can actually show you an example.
Ooh, yes.
Triple wall cardboard. I love that I have this right here. So it's taped over now, but this is the thickness. So triple wall, meaning 3 of those, sheets of cardboard that have the little curly things called flutes in them. And flutes are quite strong, and they're stacked in this thing, so they run this way, and they act like rebar in a building. So triple wall is actually, this is a stool.
Is that a stool? I was about.
They make a ton of these actually. And at every height, but down customized to the quarter of an inch. And they do furniture, tablet holders, wheelchair adaptations, fittings over other standard chairs for kids all over New York City with disabilities. And they do that, for a fraction of the cost of mass manufactured tools, not instead of those tools, but they do this kind of design for one repeatedly and over in order to account for the fact that a child's body changes every 6 months, right? And to stay right at the cusp of their development, and also to build from their desires. So like they've built, for a kid, let's say, who has non-normative legs, is trying to reach their desk at school. Okay, maybe there's one standard chair there, but at Adaptive Design, they will, out of this stuff, build the fitting that goes on the cafeteria bench so that they're sitting then now at the right height at the lunch table, right? And all the difference that makes to that child's social development in addition to their learning. And what I try to show folks who are obsessed with this idea of 19th century manufacturing and scale is that the Adaptive Design Association is building, again, bespoke design for one over and over. They train people all over the world. They have a video library on their website. They're doing what Ezio Manzini, the Italian design scholar, calls diffuse design. So they have a mode of manufacturing with this very low-tech material in the global supply chain, put together with very, accessible and affordable joinery and dowels and so on. Ordinary glue, that kind of thing, can be built in any part of the world. And they share knowledge that then is networked by digital sharing, right? And by workshops and all kinds of, so that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what scale is and about what are the desirable objects in our lives and where would they come from. So if folks are on the call and they're engineers and designers of any kind, we're taught, right, to say, but does it scale, right? That's a clever idea you have there, Sarah. Does it scale? Meaning, can I, in a 19th century way, make a widget that will arrive at under $10 in the big box store? Now, when it comes to those kitchen tools, you want them to end there. But is that the only thing that you want to put your energy, your ingenuity, and your efforts behind? And I think the answer is no. I think in a 21st century distributed manufacturing, digital fabrication universe, like, why would we hang on to that old idea? So here are these people, and the reason why people don't see this stuff as like innovative and interesting, why? It's because a lot of reasons. It's because it's the world of special education and the world of women who are occupational therapists and who are doing this, sort of masterful carpentry. But because it's associated with kids, they think like, how heartwarming, how rewarding, right? Too bad they're not in the lab down the street doing the real engineering work. So I was quite determined to write about this in the context of that, of innovation.
And I think you summed it up beautifully. You talked about Alex Truesdell, who's the former executive director, and she founded the ADA. She said, you build one and you change everything.
That's right. That's right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because she says that there are lots of people in the world who have misfit bodies. There are lots of people in the world who actually do know how to build stuff. She says the people who are missing are the people in the middle who are enfranchised to say, can it be different than it is? Can it be different? So build for one and change everything, meaning you say the world as it is will not suffice. I am going to get in there and intervene like that. She says that's the rarity, right? Because so many of us are habituated to think, well, can't be helped, right? It's a tragedy, but it can't be helped, right? Or I'm going to be the inventor of the thing that has to scale, right, and go to the big box store. But meanwhile, there's all this incredible creativity, urgent creativity available to us.
Regime changing, which is a question I really wanted to ask you, and I think it's kind of come up in the background of a lot of the subjects that we've discussed already, which is that able-bodiedness as it's viewed as a capitalist, your ability to participate in product creation yourself as a product and your productivity, the Industrial Revolution, and Gus and I discovered that we were on really different sides of this argument last time I joined in Future Brunch, when I brought up and shared my enthusiasm for the concept of universal basic income. Yeah. I presume that it would that you'd have an opinion about it with the inclusivity sphere, but how does that concept sit on that side of the imaginary fence?
Yeah, I mean, I see the connection you're making, which is like, okay, if assistance is universal, and if human worth could find a ground that isn't about being a productive citizen in a certain kind of salary-making way and so on, then isn't that an argument for UBI? a lot of people I respect are with you, Shasta, on that. And I just haven't done enough research to really understand the, what are all the scenarios. But I will say about that, particular kind of policy in particular contexts. But I will say that it doesn't take a very radical political imagination to get behind forms of assistance, which again, in Australia, you have far more even than we do, right? Like I live in a kind of scorched earth time in the United States around forms of just like investing in neighborhoods, just investing in public education, just, kind of letting old age actually be dignified, cared for, a worry-free moment of your life. So it doesn't, in other words, you can fall on every gradation of the spectrum about like, do we burn it all down? Is capitalism inherently corrupting, right? Is there no way out of this kind of transactional mode of life? You can fall on that quite radical, end of the spectrum. You can also fall in a quite reformist spot on that spectrum and say, I just like to organize around some more assistance, right? Some more. But I do think that, UBI, I do think has at its core this question, which remains unresolved for us, which is, what is the dignity of consciousness? What is that? Where would we find it? How would we locate it? Right? I mean, the eugenic logic that I mentioned before, which again, we can look at history and sort of think, well, we certainly aren't like those people. And yet when it comes right down to it, around things like allocating ventilators for folks in hospitals and things, that all the scenarios that we had to play out this year, you see use value of human beings being played out in every one of those conversations. It's so tacit, right? Whose lives are worth living? Who has a high quality of life? How would we grade that and know who is independently fit to actually make that judgment?
Constant process of triage.
Say again?
This constant process of triaging everyone all the time.
That's right. And I see why people are going to be like, oh, what an academic. I see why people arrive at use value, right? Like it comes from, it's in the air and the water that we breathe, right? Use value as a kind of metric. We don't want it, but gosh, when it comes right down to it, right? So, but the question is alive and heart beating in our world, which is, again, I just would submit to people, what is the dignity of consciousness? If we're not going to be measured as workers, how will we be measured? And how would you know? I mean, there really are, these are questions, these are humanistic questions and absolutely resist technological analysis, right? They are humanistic, global wisdom tradition questions. Why are we here? What do we owe to each other? What is a good life, right? What is happiness? What is wisdom? All that stuff. And disability is one of the many ways that we have to, if we're going to grapple with it, we have to actually go that far. So I think UBI scares people because it goes pretty deep. It goes like, how can a person be, right? And how can they be respected as such?
That's a fantastic counter question.
Yeah, it's and also just to some, for me, one of the tensions it's not a tension, but it's a theme that's in the book is that individuality and collectivity, the one and the many, both of those ideas actually make meaning in our lives.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And citizens, and that runs all the way through your book, which I love. It's such a different way of looking at it. I want to I've got a question here from Jan, who is one of our future brunch, or Jan, sorry, Jan, I don't know if I've got your name right there, one of our future brunch regulars. He's asked a question. He said that he kind of comes from a computer studies and computer science background, and he studied assisted technologies in the 70s and 80s. And he said for him, the big challenge was actually about implementing the technology into people's lives. And this was way more tricky and complicated than when it comes to sort of traditional business or science. Can you talk about what it's like to implement technology into people's lives? And can you talk about it specifically in the context of deaf space, which I think is just such an amazing concept and really kind of blew my mind. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Jan is a she. I'm so sorry, Jan.
Yeah. I'm picturing a French man sipping coffee. Now I can picture a French woman sipping coffee.
So that's Jan's question. Can you answer it in the context of deaf space, and maybe talk a bit about deaf space, because it's one of my favorite things in the book?
Yeah, well, I think
Jan, you may be thinking of just like that kind of adoption valley that has long plagued assistive technologies, especially when they're developed in the lab and not proceeding from a human-centered design kind of just design logic. So we have a huge number of technological developments that are in an abstract way designed for assistance, but they don't actually have people in their lives doing that user testing way upstream in the design process. And so you may have been thinking about that adoption gap again, where a lot of things fall off a cliff because why? Because people are radically adaptive and they do lots of stuff in their worlds that if they're not, if the thing is, it doesn't really come from this kind of hunger for that gadget that's going to arrive at the right time, you just get a lot of people going like, I just don't have time, to make this work. So there is that. And I do think that human-centered design has in the last, certainly compared to a couple of decades ago, has become much more the language and the vernacular of labs and studios. So, I mean, in part, that's thanks to like the big design firms like IDEO, and that a human-centered design process, meaning that starts first with kind of ethnography 101 and kind of anthropological looks at like interviewing people, but not just in a yes/no way, being in their lives, shadowing them, asking them what they're after and what they really want. So I do think very broad strokes I'm painting here, that does actually solve some of the implementation kind of gap thing. I will just refer back to Alex Truesdell and what I mentioned before, which is the absence of the question asker. I think sometimes folks who are on the receiving end of assistive technologies from the experts in the lab feel like obligated to say thank you. I mean, I have a story, of a family in the chair chapter who's sort of like, wouldn't it be rude to say it's not quite right? Wouldn't it be ungrateful, right, to meet this technologist and say, if I'm honest, it's not really the thing that I wanted, because here they've spent all this time doing it. So you get the social dynamics. Now the Institute for Human-Centered Design here in Boston has what's called the User Expert Lab. And so people are paid for their time to come and try out your app, right, when it's in beta, rather than going like, here, we dropped you a widget, a plugin, something that we don't even actually know if it kind of comes from your life. So to get to Deaf Space, so in the Room chapter, it opens with a scene at Gallaudet University, which is here in the United States and is in Washington, D.C., was chartered by Abraham Lincoln, actually, in 1864. So I know, right? And deaf education has been around for a long time, including waxing and waning with the politics of identity and also eugenics and so on. It's a fascinating history. But Gallaudet is an all deaf or deaf and hard of hearing campus. So students who go there, some of whom these days, like a statistically significant number of students, are new to sign. So sometimes they've been raised not to be signers, but to lip read and do other kinds of workarounds, but they go to Gallaudet in part because they want to join a signing community. So Gallaudet, as a result, is a built environment that is entirely organized around deafness, which is to say, it is not interested actually in the condition of hearing. My engineering students find this impossible to believe, but in fact, so plenty of people there are wearing cochlear implants. Maybe they have some mixed relationship to hearing, but the goal there is not to actually meet the, in the square peg round hole thing, is to not meet the norms of the hearing world, but in fact to celebrate the beauty and the integrity of sign, which is a visual language, but not just a visual language that's one-to-one. It's a richly, spatial language that includes like your field of vision out from the body itself. So deaf education and the designing around deafness has been with us for a long time. And if you go to the archives at Gallaudet, you'll see, for example, a somatic doorbell. So it used to be in the old buildings, they would have a doorbell, which you'd pull a chain from the outside and a weight would drop. And the vibration that you would feel from that, if you were somebody on the inside, would alert you that there's somebody at the door. And these days, that's translated into, you don't knock on the door at somebody's office, you flip the lights on and off from outside. So the switches are all on the exterior. So it's like, yeah, it's a really interesting, like, alternate sensory.
I'm just laughing because it's like, it's classic, like, possession horror movie.
Where you're just like, you mean just like, oh my God, I hadn't thought of this thing. The
lights flashing on and off. But it makes so much sense.
Yes.
It's such a small change. It's such a simple thing. It makes so much sense. I love the ingenuity. It's technology, but it's just also like logical.
Right. That's right. And doesn't take like some kind of huge, certainly not a technology protagonist, right, swooping in. So in the last decade or so, an architect named Hansel Baumann and a bunch of Gallaudet students and Gallaudet alums and other researchers decided to sort of look around their campus and say, what are all the ways that this visual language of sign and communication can be codified and made into a set of principles that we could point to and say, that's what it means to be deaf in architectural terms. And they came up with a list of 100 design principles that are kind of organized in 5 categories that they call deaf space, which is to say, again, architects often talk about a building as an envelope, right, that wraps around you, and deaf space is an envelope around deaf ways of being. So if you go there, you might think like, oh, these glossy modern buildings with, lots of light and so on, and open plans and things, but you'd be missing some of the key choices. So in the deaf space architecture that has arisen as a result of these principles, you'll find, for example, super long sight lines across rooms that have room dividers that are at half height rather than full walls that divide rooms. Why? Because you don't need to make a barrier for sound. You actually need to be able to communicate short, medium, and long range distances, right? And noise is not your enemy there. And similarly, there's a huge emphasis on natural light because you don't want to interrupt. If you're signing outdoors and you walk through into a building and it's suddenly dark, you have a big disruption in the manual kind of communication of signs. Same with door width, so that people can look at one another. Did you want to say something about that, Shasta?
No, I was just like, again, just makes so much sense. A thing I've never had to think of before. I'm enjoying it so much.
This is Shasta going, my mind is blown right now.
Yeah, me too. I can't even tell you. I mean, and that was the situation too, where I was doing interviews with students that day, and a lot of people who are hearing might not realize that deaf folks enjoy music too in that somatic way. So I was in the lobby of a building with those long sight lines and interviewing students. And so I had to hear an interpreter, right, who was voicing to me, and the students were signing to her. And there was music playing at a cafe kiosk in that same lobby really loudly. Right, because what a beautiful pleasure, like the thrum of that bass, right, that gets you right here. And if you're a deaf person, that's how you're enjoying it. But I had to say, could we go outside to finish the interview? Because I, of course, became disabled by that environment, right? I couldn't actually sense to hear. And you realize that, right, like the dynamics just switch like on a dime, like that. It was all the difference, right? Just those kinds of moves. But so there's a huge number of design details that I talk about in the room chapter about deaf space. But the thing that's really amazing too is the signing Starbucks, which is in the neighborhood of Gallaudet. And it is nothing more, nothing less than a regular old Starbucks, right, with its completely homogeneous kind of architecture. But it is staffed entirely by deaf employees. And all they've done to make it possible for a hearing person like me to order coffee is to just make the tiniest, not even very high-tech, subtle changes, where it's like a wipe-away tablet. You write down your order and your name comes up on a monitor. At the end, you do your card in that automated way that we do now. But it's so interesting because folks there do not make an attempt to make apologetics for the fact that they're signing. They don't voice at all. They don't actually call on somebody to interpret. We have this goodwill exchange where the dynamics are just reversed and shifted, right? I am a voicing person who comes into that deaf space provisionally that's half filled with deaf people and half hearing folks. And I get my coffee and I go back to the public sphere. I mean, it's just astonishing. And it's also really ordinary. I mean, it's just kind of like blows my mind.
For deaf space engineering particularly, what I picture is it's building square holes for square pegs. And so all of that mismatch.
That's right.
Evaporates.
That's right. And I think people may see that and go like, well, are you asking for a bespoke universe for each person? Like how will we ever have the special, square pegs for square holes? And I don't think that that's actually the point. Just as you said, Gus, every one of us is negotiating how I'm an individual and how I'm part of a group, how I'm going to bring my body to the world, when I'm going to ask the world to come a little more toward my body. And I think what's interesting about Jeff's space is that those folks paid such close attention to what are people actually doing with their time and planning on human inventiveness and human surprises. And just like in the engineering lab where people get in love with a technique or a material, architects also in the studio get an idea of a modernist, sculptural grand vision. And they've paid rather less attention to like, what are people doing in all these incredibly interesting navigational ways. And when we look especially at non-normativity, we see that in particular.
Yeah, and again, I think you summed it up beautifully in the book. You said that to be a really great designer, you need not just a mechanical ability, but a mechanical disposition. And you defined that as the ability to see what was necessary and then proceed to build it, switching directions as trial and error required. So that mechanical disposition is something that really, again, is resonant in so many of the things that you're talking about here. I want to... So we've got about, we're going to run about 5 or 10 minutes over because I know we're supposed to finish at 10 o'clock, but I don't want to. This is so much we want to explore. So I'd like to ask permission from all of our viewers. If we run over by about 10 minutes, please, if you do need to leave, that's totally fine. Shasta, you look like you had something that you wanted to ask.
Oh, I was just going to join in. All my synapses are firing, but I think everyone has had that experience of observing something, of using something, of receiving something expensive and well-made that was just super disappointing. Again, like that unifying of the disability experience, or that shared experience. So it's not a disability specific experience at all. It's like, somebody, has made something with lots of time and energy, and you're like, it wasn't worth the money.
That's right. And that, I think, plagues industrial design generally, but I think there's something extra when you get really warm-hearted engineers and designers, and I do think that they're warm-hearted, right? Who are, again, in that mode of thinking, I'm going to do inclusion now, right? And so I'm going to drop this goodie, in people's lives, not imagining that, in fact, they are some of the most creative people already doing their lives, So Liz Jackson calls that like a disability dongle, where people go like, I'm making up a need, and I'm going to drop it into the world. And so
well-meaning.
Right, well-meaning, right, totally well-meaning. But if you don't see yourself as connected to the state of disability, then you can get into that, I think, that sort of wrong-headed thinking. If you're thinking about on behalf of somebody, and this is where even empathy gets a little misguided, right? Where you sort of like taking on the shoes of, and I just want to go like, really and truly, you are a body who has needs, right? If you just take that seriously, get really interested in that fact, and then take a look at folks at Gallaudet and go, look at the ways that having that sharp misfit has actually made them extra inventive.
That tension of like entitlement and exclusion, in the way that so much of our built world has been made by one quite specific group of people, which has been white men. The majority of tampons and period products and bras were all created by people who have majoritively none of those appendages that need taken care of.
Right. I know. I mean, that's, again, industrial design at large, right? And so human-centered design, yes, but also not as a crank to turn, but just look everywhere, truly everywhere, meaning look at the occupational therapists, the special educators, the ordinary students at Gallaudet, Chris at the diaper changing table, folks at the dementia village in the Netherlands. I mean, look at all those places where the needful body is being adapted and remade in the deep creative ways that we want in our world.
The final chapter in your book deals with time. And again, there were at least 5 or 6 concepts in your book that made me look differently at the world. But and this was definitely one of them. This idea that we live in the concept of industrial time, and that when we escape from industrial time, there's always that incredible feeling of liberation that so many of us get. And it can be when we're sick, it can be when we're on holiday, it can be when we maybe are laid off. But then sooner or later, we're sucked back into industrial time. And what you talk about in your book is you say that the experience of being a person with a disability, or caring for a person with a disability, or just being linked intimately with someone with a disability, allows you to experience time in a different way to many other people. And that for you was a bonus. It was a positive in your life. Can you talk a little bit about industrial time and your son and how that's for you?
Absolutely. And I should say, without romanticizing it at all, right, that Graham, my son who's 14, who has Down syndrome, is negotiating his misfit world in his own ways, right? And he, I say in the beginning of the book, and I try to revisit this idea that disability, it seems to me, from a decade of learning about it, has both closures in our experience. So there are things that shut down to us and become not available to us. And it also has openings in our experience. So I would say that raising Graham, I actually do have a deep sense of urgency because of the way that he misfits. I am going to need to think about him for the long haul. I'm very aware of that, right? He is among the most vulnerable people alive, economically, but also just existentially, because he is radically gentle in a way, and that defies all mindful gentleness. Like that the vulnerability of that is bracing and urgent, I will say. And also, he, as a deeply adaptive person in the world, who is not actually wed to industrial time in the forms that he experiences it, he is not actually interested in how well he does in school compared to his peers. I think he is actually aware that he is different from his peers in lots of ways. He doesn't actually see it as a source of self-worth. And to be his parent is to be somebody marveling at this dimensional human who has infinite gifts, who has relationships and influences other people, and who has preferences and idiosyncrasies and a very quirky sense of humor, and can be a total pain in the ass, just like all the rest of us. And he gets to be that, and that's the dignity of being conscious there again too. Like he has helped me to ask again, how can a person be? What is a person, right? Unearned, no meritocratic, kind of worth and standing. So I talk about this in that chapter of the clock because it's about time, and not about the literal clock, but about this economic clock. Like how fast should Graham proceed through K-12 education? What kind of speed would prove how high functioning he is in the language of evaluation in that way? And I get to actually, through a lot of history and stuff about developmental disability, I get to this word retarded, which is a neutral term in its description, right? It means, we talk about flame retardants and things, but it's so telling to me that retarded has become a kind of slur. It's become weaponized, a clock word, right? To be slow is to be unworthy. To be slow is to be defective. To be slow is to be undesirable. To be slow is to be, right? And how telling, right? Not about my kiddo, I can tell you that. Not telling about that. It's telling about the dominant order of the world, right? That the repulsion about slowness and signifies about human worth. So that's where the closure and the opening thing for me has been this invitation as his mother. And yes, as you said, Gus, I have to think about this. I mean, the feminist scholars call this derivative dependence. Like, I do have to think about Graham for the long haul, economically and otherwise. So we are deeply woven together. But so few people can imagine that ecology actually has its own life-giving, incredible joy and wisdom, right? Again, without romanticizing it at all. So few people can imagine that our life is quite ordinary and replete with wonder, And so Graham's invitation to me, not just as his mother, but as a person, a productive economic unit, has been to say, well, where does my worth come from? Do I want to be measured like that? Might it be otherwise?
I would say that most teenagers exist in a space where they have to be assumed of integral worth, and completely divorced from time also.
Yeah, right. Considering all the work they're doing, you mean just developmentally, just like all.
Yeah. They just exist and sleep and have to be given the benefit of the doubt.
That's right, because they're lurking, right, and growing and doing all these things, right? But here, and again, this is probably like at a shrill level in the United States in a way that lots of other people would find bizarre, but there is this kind of like even in teenagerhood, this kind of production of anxiety about achievement and about worth that's tied to that kind of performance.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the effort I try to put into conversations I have with students as a science communicator, and I'm glad that I have access to those groups of people, is highlighting any and all of my failures to highlight. You said that you had dropped out of your PhD program, and that for you at the time was probably distressing. But to me, in the pointing end of my PhD program, I'm like, oh, they exist, and you seem fine.
Oh, yes.
Too.
Very fine. Yes.
To highlight those failures, there's such a looming black cloud in our lives the way that they are. I think one of the exciting psychological senses that I'm taking away from this conversation is that rebellion, that permission to actually say, is my able-bodied world, is our able-bodied world actually good enough? Like, how much more could we be demanding? How much better fitting? Do I want to sit on a chair that was made for, 17 other iterations of human body size?
That's right. And do I want, even if I'm, again, in the reformist way, even if I'm sanguine about markets, and again, you can fall on so many points of discussion about this, do I want the logic of the market, its language, its hewing to competition, its pitting people against one another, its ideas of optimization and productivity, do I want that mapped onto every feature of my life? So even if you accept an industrial culture and a market economy as the state of things, right? Let's say that you do you want that, again, to spread its tentacles over all your relationships so that they become transactions, over all your interior life and your sort of spiritual well-being? Call it spiritual, call it mind, call it soul, call it whatever you want, psyche. Do you want that market logic subsuming everything about who you are?
Yeah, no. You were saying it was an example, I think, that you like the person, the imaginary naysayer being like, oh, well, do you want a special tailored universe for every single individual? And it's like, every single individual does have a specially tailored universe. We make them for ourselves.
You mean in terms of, this is that dignity of consciousness?
Yeah, and our houses and our homes and the insides of our heads and the products we buy for ourselves.
Yeah, and the way we move down the street, the knitting together of that habitable universe, like this is a sensing organ, right? And I just want the wonder there. Again, it's not even, you can ask for a quite radical overhaul of the world, or you can say, if you want to say, I'm a realist, right? I live in an economic society. Oh, well, fine. But must it be that the totalizing explanation of how we're going to be together?
Sarah, your book is out. It's been out since May. If people would like to find out more about the book, if they'd like to read it, there's a button down below over here. You can just click on it. That'll take you to Sarah's website. It'll tell you a bit more about her. And there are links there to the book. I have not enjoyed a nonfiction book as much as yours in quite a while. It again, like I said, really made me look at the world differently. And I'm still enjoying the shift in perspective. So I want to thank you for writing such an amazing book. And I want to thank you for writing a book that feels very close to what we believe in here at Future Crunch. It's this idea of flipping the narrative, of putting a lens on things that we've traditionally looked at as problems and saying there are so many solutions. Humans are incredible. We're ingenious. We're capable of so much more than we realize. And I think ultimately that's why I love your work. It's very positive. And yeah, it's been great to join you for the last hour and 10 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for running over. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Shasta, any final words from you? And then Sarah, we will give you the final word.
Okay.
Yeah, like I was just hinting at, I mean, I spend a lot of my time attempting to unpick the assumptions that were programmed in. I really enjoy that, and there's some catalysts in my life that unpicked a few that kind of got that ball rolling. And so I already spend a bit of my time like looking for assumptions and asking, and taking that opportunity to be like, well, why does it have to be that way? And so I'm just energized about an entire new sphere and new tools of being like looking at the built world and I think for now of like, well, what are the assumptions here? Are they good enough? Yeah, I'm excited about that. Just that, all of that.
Yeah, right on. Well, let me just say that in the end of the book, I cite a philosopher named Maxine Greene, who talks a lot about how each of us, certainly on this call, right, lives our lives kind of between our stuff and our artifacts. And she encourages people to talk about the things in their lives, so the art, but we might say the design or the engineering. And she says, when we do that, when we get together and we talk about the way things are and the stuff in our lives, we are doing what she calls social imagination, which is just thinking as if things could be otherwise. If we're just attending to the stuff in our lives, the artifacts and the tools and the expressive works that we love, we're thinking of worlds as though they could be otherwise. And I hope that folks here will fill that invitation despite 2020, perhaps because of 2020, that the otherwise, like that is our highest calling, I think, is to keep after it, that sense that things don't have to be as they are. So.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you very much. We are looking forward to spending our day looking and being radical about the otherwise. It's been a wonderful conversation. Folks, please show your appreciation if you can in the chat box for Sarah, and we will see you hopefully for the next Future Brunch. That's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you.